you already know how you can let users post some information into your application. Now for sure there might be problems later on. For example, if you want to have a number of seats for your booking DTO, for example, and the users enters the value of -500, for example, right? So negative numbers. Or you ask him for an email and he writes down just a name. You want to add some sort of validation. Here at this side, it's backend validation, right? Because we will add it here in ASP.NET Core. So go ahead and open up your book DTO. Now, first of all, I will take that GUID flight ID and bring it into the next line just to make it a little bit better visible. Now, we need a new namespace, so go ahead and add a using directive, which is using system.componentModel.data annotation. Now, a data annotation for us right now is nothing else than a simple attribute that we can add to a field, for example. So flight ID, passenger email, and number of seats are all required for us to say that the book DTO is valid. So if we don't have a flight ID, we cannot even find a flight. If we don't have a passenger email, we cannot say who is booking the flight, so the information is completely useless. If we don't know how many seats the user wants to book, we can also say that the information is not correct. So let's go ahead and add the first attribute to it. And the data annotation that we're using here is called required. So required is only appearing for flight ID right now because they are both attached. Now copy required and assign it to every field inside here, to every property, because all of them are required. So you don't have to set them as required, right? Not if it's not required for your data, but for our book DTO, it is required. So later on, for example, you know that from filling out some forms in the internet, some of those forms have those little asterisk, which is marking this one is required. And some other fields are optional, for example, right? So this is what it is about. Required fields are fields that you have to fill out. Now, there's even more to say. For example, what happens if a passenger fills in an email address field, but writes down something like Janik, right? This is not an email address because the format should be at least this one. You should have an @ sign and, well, at least some sort of domain. However, for this, we have another data annotation and it's called, again, assign it as an attribute, it's called email address. Now this takes care about the format of the entered string value, and if it's not an email address, the validation will fail. However, it's working like this. You got that book DTO, and if the flight ID is missing, or if the number of seats is not given, or if the email address is in the wrong format, then the book DTO will not be valid. So the whole entry, the whole object will not be valid if one of those, well, data annotations is failing. Now, there are still some more data annotations that we want to use. For example, the string length. So this one, as you can already tell, is to define how long a string can be. So let's say at a maximum of 100 and a minimum length of 3, for example. So the email address has to be between 3 and 100 characters. Now, let's move on to number of seats. This is a byte value. So we don't want the user to add negative numbers or values above 255. So let's go ahead and add a new attribute, and this one is called the range. We want to add a lower range from 1 to 254, for example. So if the user enters a value like 0 or -100, the validation will fail and the book DTO will not be valid anymore, and the user will be given an error telling what's wrong. We will take a look at that just in a second. Now let me show you that page here. It's directly from Microsoft System Component Model Data Annotations namespace. Here you can see all of the attributes or data annotations that you can use. You can also find phone attribute, min length attribute, required attribute, you know that, right? String length attribute, and some credit card attribute, for example, phone attribute, so there are some. Now you can also see a brief description, validates an email address, or here specifies the minimum length of an array, whatever. So these are data annotations that we can use to add some sort of validation to our backend. Now let's start the application, save it like this, start it and open up Swagger. When we now go ahead and use our /flight post endpoint to book a flight, and we simply use that example data here. So go ahead and click on try it out. and simply use it like this. You got that flight ID, which is not real good, but doesn't really matter. You got that string, which is not an email address, and you got number of seats, which is 0, so also not a valid value for us. Hit execute. Now scroll down, and in the response you will now see some error information. Number of seats. The field number of seats must be between 1 and 254. The passenger email field is not a valid email address, right? So now we have that 400 response, and you know that 400 error codes are caused by the user, right? So these are caused by the clients because the client has entered some invalid information, even though we're using that REST API here or using it in Angular later on, right? But we are client side because we only have two sides. We have got that server side and we got client side. And as long as we are using a website or whatever or a REST API directly, we are always the client. Now, if we would enter correct values, everything would work fine. But as I said, now you can see that we have some sort of validation and some information for the user to be provided to him so that he knows what causes the errors to get shown to him. Okay, so the book DTO is one of our DTOs. Switch over to the new passenger DTO. So I guess you know now what you have to do, right? So we again use some data annotations right here. So go ahead and add using system component model dot data annotations. Also here, new passenger DTO, all of the fields right here should be required. For sure, if you like, you can change them. If you don't want to have that gender flag, you can definitely change it, make it an enumerator if you want to have additional values, right? So feel free to do whatever you like. We decided to take a Boolean value here to show you how bools are working. So this is the reason why we needed to complete that, because we have an integer for the number of seats and we got string values, and we for sure wanted to add a Boolean value. Now, add required to all of them, because all of the information that we have here is required, right? So we don't want to miss any of those. The user has to make a selection or has to enter a value for all of these fields. Now, for email address here, we can again go ahead and add the string length attribute and set it to 100 and min length or minimum length to 3. Again, since this is an email address, in between I will add email address. So there is no rule of order, right? So you can simply go ahead and adjust it as you like. You can also set required to the very end, so no problem at all. And for first name and last name, we go ahead and use min length, and this time we set it to 2. And we also use max length and set it to 35. Nearly no one should have a first name which is longer than 35 characters. I guess that should be a fine number. And we for sure add this also for last name. Great, so now we have the annotation here set to. So again, head over to Swagger. But one thing to mention before is that these data annotations are only working, or that sort of input validation, if you have inside of your controllers the API controller attribute attached. So this makes them automatically work. So the validation is working then. Go ahead and check if you have API controller for both of your controllers set, right? So you should, if you followed along, you should have that. But I just want to say, if you don't have that set, the input validation will not automatically take place. Let's go to our passenger post endpoint here. Click on try it out and simply hit execute again. And you should see client error 400. Email address is not a valid email address. So if we change that, it should be working. And also if we just make a very, very, very long first name and remove gender, let's hit execute. You can see email address not working. The first name must be string, right? And he's not complaining about the missing Boolean because it's like the default value is false. So even though we don't submit anything, it is still a value automatically provided because the Boolean value has a default value. Okay, great. Now we've tested it with Swagger. Let's move on to Angular and try to fill out some invalid information over there. Okay, so here in Angular, open up the console, and when you're using Chrome, go ahead and try to find that network tab here. For me it's in German, but that shouldn't matter. It's saying simply network. Keep that just open. Go ahead and search your flight. And now let's try to book a flight. And here we can register a new user. Let me just clear that log and let me enter some values. So I'm gonna say for email, just Yannick, and then Yannick. There we go. And a very, very long last name. There we go. And now let me simply hit login. You can simply ignore that one here because he was just trying to find an email address, which is Yannick. So this was our automatically blur call. Let me just remove that again. Now let me click on login. You can see we got a 400 error here. So open that up. Let me just increase the size here. And you can see if you scroll down into the response tab and scroll through it, one or more validation errors occurred, and you can see errors, email, the email field is not a valid email address, last name, the field last name must be a string. So as you can see, we have the information also received here in our network tab in Chrome browser, but that shouldn't make a difference. The only thing that is important for us is that ASP sent over some validation information. So, hey, it failed, and it failed because of those errors, right? So ASP sent us those informations, and as you can see, I'm not able to proceed here, right? So I cannot click on login. So I can do that, but as you can see on the right side, it fires a lot of errors and I cannot proceed. So that's the main difference. We have the information about what's wrong, and now we can go to Angular and also display them for sure. So because right now as a user, I'm not sure what's wrong, right? So for sure I can guess that, okay, it's not an email address, right? But we should for sure show them some validation errors here. So we should display a nice message in a red text, for example, or as an alert. However, the functionality is that we cannot proceed because we have an error and not a succeed status code. And that's the main reason why we have added validation. So super easy to add, right? So returning validation errors late can harm both performance and user experience. And right now, as you have seen, our user does not get any error information. Imagine that you fill out a form completely, and at the end, by clicking the submit button, you see multiple validation errors. Had you known you were making mistakes earlier, you would have stopped proceeding and wasting your time, right? So generally speaking, the earlier you prevent the user from making mistakes, the more accessible it is for the user to fix it. The more time you save the user and the better the user experience will become. Now, for example, we can inform the user about the errors while typing. In that case, by each word the user types, the client application can send the request to the server to receive the errors. There are still multiple problems with this approach. The user still needs to wait for the response by typing each character. The communication between client and server would become chatty, and as the number of users increases, the number of requests also increases by a lot, right? Which ultimately affects the bandwidth and resource consumption of the server-side application exponentially. So a better way is to also validate the input on the client side. If a user calls the API directly, as we did, using Swagger UI, we still should prevent invalid data from being posted to the application, right? So later on there might be a use case where a user simply uses your REST API through CURL or Postman or whatever, or any mobile application, and then you really want to have that backend validation that we have already implemented. But in order to be a little bit more professional in Angular and to save some server requests and to create a better feedback loop, we want to go ahead and also add front-end client validation. So in the end, we will have two validation positions, front-end and back-end. Well, so the best of all. So in the end, we will have the most security for sure. So you may wonder if there is any way to copy the server-side validation to the client side. The number of seats, for example, has the same validation rule at both client side and server. Wouldn't it be better if I could copy the validation rules for the number of seats field, for example? Keep in mind that there is no necessarily a one-to-one relationship between client and server-side inputs, nor between the validation rules of inputs. Some API inputs may not come from the user interface, even if they all come from the UI. The user may enter them at a different time than the time of posting them to the server. Okay, now that said, let's move on to Angular and add some validation over there. Now head over to our client app folder, open up source, open up app, and go to the book flight component and then TS, so TypeScript. Now inside that file, highlighting is just coming in a second, we can go ahead and enter or import validators from Angular Forms, right? So here we got that already at Angular Forms, and we got the form builder. And in the same namespace or in the same library, we also can find the validators. Now let's scroll down, and when we build our form right here, right, number, this is for our how many seats you want to book, and we have default value set to 1. And now inside of that array here, we can go ahead and add another value, so comma separated. We're gonna add validators dot required. So we make that number here also required. It's pretty similar to what we have done in ASP.NET Core, right? Now, here in book, right? So this is when we actually click the book button. Before we run any code and subscribe here so that we book a flight, we check if the validation is successful before we do anything. So we handle it directly here on client side. If this .form.invalid, we want to return in the moment where a validator here is not passing. So for example, we don't provide any number or we don't provide any seat information, the validator will fail and the entire form will not be valid anymore. So then form will be invalid and we will return even before we can do anything else here. Now let's go ahead and try that out. Here I am logged in as a user, and now if I go ahead and I want to book a seat, check what happens. Let me book, and you can see that it totally fine worked. Now let me switch back, and number of seats, let me set that to 0. You can see we got a 400 response. And now let me completely remove the number of seats, so no value at all. You can see that we cannot post. So we now have 3 scenarios. Like this, if we don't have even any value, it gets handled by client side. So just the lines of code that we have just added in this video. And if we enter a value like -100, ASP.NET Core will send us some information about 400 error. And the information about must be between 1 and 254. And if we enter a correct value like 3 or 2 or whatever, we will proceed here. Now, there's still that thing that we need to show the user, hey, you cannot book if you don't enter a correct value, right? So if I go ahead and simply delete it here so that there is no number at all, and I click on book, I even don't get any message. So I'm not talking about the console at all. I'm just talking about the user interface. So the user should see any information right here. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's switch to our bookflight component.html. Here we are, bookflight component HTML. Let's scroll to the very, very bottom. Let's enter some validation message here. So first of all, I will create a div. If you don't want to copy that or write down that HTML, you can check the Git repository, right? Check the date 12 commit. And here we got a class. First of all, we add some styling, right? Invalid feedback d-block. And now the important part, so I will write that down here. We write down an asterisk and then ngIf. So Angular if equals to form, right? So remember, form is the field that we have inside of the component. It's that one here, form dot controls dot number dot invalid. So number is here pointing to that number, right? So controls something like this, and inside there we got number. So form controls number, and if this one is invalid and it has a validator, right, so it can be invalid, then we want to go ahead and display number of seats is invalid. So let me explain you that ngIf. That ngIf here is only rendered if a specific condition is matching. So that entire div block here is only shown when that form control number is invalid. So if this is not true, then the div will not be visible at all. Okay, let's save it and check our application again. Now let me remove the 1 here so that we have no value at all to trigger our Angular, and you can see number of seats is invalid. So now we have an information, right? And as soon as I write down something, it automatically appears, even though I enter like a number of -10 or whatever. But just keep in mind that right now our validator is only checking for required. So it's not checking if the value is in a specific range. We only check if we have a value. Great. So now your key learning is that you can show some information depending on if you have well, a specific condition matched, like here, and that you can have a form in Angular and check for its invalid status, and that you can for sure add some validators right here. Okay, so now, as you may have already guessed, just like in ASP.NET Core Microsoft, you also have in Angular that validator series. You can see add Angular forms library, and you can see required. We got min, we got max, we got min length, max length. So we don't have so many like in ASP.NET Core, but still enough. So we can go ahead and add those validators to our specific form fields. So these are the built-in validators Angular already has prepared for us. And now let's use them and compose all of the validators that we need for our form fields. In this video, we will go ahead and use some more validators, because right now our booking seats, which is that number here, is only checking if we have a value, but not if the value is in a specific range. So how can we use multiple validators? It's pretty simple. We go ahead and call validators.compose. So we compose many together, and inside here we got an array. And the first one is validators.required, like the one we had before. So we have required validators.min, so at least 1, and validators.max 254, right? So exactly like the same values that we have also used in ASP.NET Core. So we got required, min, and max. I guess you can see in which direction that points. Let's start the application, save first, and let's check what this did. Here we are now again. I can simply enter an email address I have registered already. And now I can search for a flight, go ahead and book a flight, and enter a number of seats in a range that it's not valid. For example, 0. Oh, as you can see, number of seats is invalid. -100, number of seats is invalid. Completely removing, number of seats is invalid. 900, number of seats is invalid. And as you can see, as soon as I adjust the value, it automatically appears, and this is because of the data binding, which is taking place here instantly. When I just go ahead and do it like this, number of seats is invalid, or like 1000, number of seats is invalid. Well, number of seats is invalid is a general message. And you might want to help the user to fix the error by giving him a more specific message. So here we are again at Angular, validating form input. Let me scroll a little bit down. You can see validating input in template-driven forms. This is exactly what we have done so far, or what we are implementing right now. And you can see here that there are multiple conditions. So here's an input, right? And you can see it's bound to hero name, so a simple string. And then we have that ng if when the name is invalid, for example, and then it goes below into another if tree, and you have name errors. If it's required, you show a message called name is required. And if the min length is not correct, you say name must be at least 4 characters long. And if the name is Bob, like forbidden name or whatever, name cannot be Bob, right? So here we're just talking about displaying different error messages. And you can see that nested if statements here really directly inside of Angular. Now let's switch back to our Angular project. Inside of the flight component, or book flight component here, we got our form. We will now create a getter for getting that number here. So scroll to the very bottom, create a getter, get number, and that one simply return this dot form dot controls dot number, right? So it just takes the form and then gets the controls and then takes the number here. So we get that value. So a very, very simple getter, like you would write it down in C#2. So now in our HTML, we go ahead and here we get that div, right? Number invalid. We want to shorten it up now because we have our property or our getter. So we can simply use him, just number, right? And then invalid. You can use it like this right now. And then we go ahead and use number.dirty or number.touched. So I will explain that just in a second, but just for you, we call it this number here, and that one returns controls number. So it doesn't only return, well, a value like 1 or 2, it returns the object, and the object can be invalid, right? So just as it was before, but now we can write that shorter since we have that getter and don't really have to use that form control number invalid, form control number dirty, form control number touched, right? So this is where we use the getter to make it really shorter. So if the number is invalid and number is dirty or number is touched, as I said, I will get to that dirty and touched just in the next step. And then we want to show div number of seats is invalid. And we want to remove that, or we want to change that. Let's call it changing, right? So let's remove the content of that div. First of all, as I said, in that ngIf, we now create another ngIf to make this nested. So ngIf equals to, now let's write down the statement, number dot errors. We got an error object. Let's check if we have it. And if we don't have it, that's, well, we don't need to show it at all, right? Because we're just caring about errors here. And we can check if it's required. And you can guess that this is the validator that we have used right here, required. So this is why we can also use min and max, because we have set it. So if the number has errors and has the required error, then we want to go ahead and say, for example, how many people do you want to book the flight for? So that we now show more detailed information. Let's go ahead and copy that 2 times, because we have 2 more. We got min and we got max. So again, if you take too much care about writing down everything, just instead listen and watch what I do, and later on copy it from the GitHub repository if this more appeals to you, right? So ngIf number errors min, we want to go ahead and adjust it and say you cannot book for less than 1 passenger, right? And exactly as you may already guessed, our planes do not have more than, for example, 200. Well, what a guess, right? 254 seats. Who would have guessed that this is like the byte size? Okay, let's save it and take a look again at the application. Let me log in real quick, yannick@dev.com. And there we go. Let's search a flight. Let's book a flight. And we got 1. Amazing. Going down to 0. You cannot book for less than 1 passenger. Well, we can actually for sure fix that typo here. And again, 255. Our planes do not have more than 254 seats. So you can see we now have information provided to our user, which really helps him to figure out the problem. Is my email address too long? Is my email address in the wrong format? Did I provide any email address? Same goes here for number of seats, for example. So you really want to take care about showing the correct information to the user to increase the usability of your application. Now you can not. That looks better. Great. Okay, so let's proceed here and talk about dirty and touched in the next video. So here we are inside of the Angular documentation, because I want to now talk about touched and dirty. So form group can have controls, right? You already know that. For example, our input field for a number. And here you can see we get dirty and touched. Let's check for dirty and touched right now. You can see a control, so for example an input field, right, is dirty if the user has changed the value in the UI. Or it is touched if a control has triggered a blur event on it. So once we come to the page, dirty and touched are not true. And this is why we are using them inside of our condition in the ngIf to only display messages once they are dirty or touched. So once you enter the value or once you blurred away from an input field, for example. So because we don't want to come to the page, all input fields are empty and we want to see 100 error messages complaining about you have not entered something, right? So only show information about errors once the user entered something and the input is not as expected. Great. So dirty, the value of the control is changed, and touched will be set to true once we fired a blur event on the control. Okay, now we have validated our book flight and we only have here a simple control for number, right? So let's move on to our register component. Let me close this here. And on the right side, go into your register passenger component and open up register passenger component HTML and register component.ts. And as you can have maybe already guessed, we again use the validator here. So inside of Angular Forms, Form Builder, go ahead again and grab the validators. Now scroll a little bit down and inside of our form, again, we will now use validators compose. So for email address, let's generate validators.compose, and inside here we create an array in the call, and now we use validators.required, validators min length, and validators max length. So validators.min length, set that to 3, and validators.max length, set that to 100. Make sure to use the same values as in ASP.NET Core, right? Because that makes sense. And now let's grab it here, validators compose, and let's paste it into every field, but not in the last one. So let's add a comma, and let's add a comma here too. There we go. And we got required for all of them. And here we got min length also set to 3 and 100. That's fine. Oh no, we're talking about first and last name. I'm sorry. It's 35. We set that to 35. Now to 100. 35, there we go. And the min length, we didn't define it in ASP. You can go ahead and set it to maybe to 2, right? So there are some names which have just 2 characters, so that's fine. Min length 2 and max 35 for first name and last name. And for is female or gender or whatever you want to call it, you go ahead and just say validators required, because we don't need anything else. So we don't need to call validators compose. Great, so if you are a little bit confused now about the validators, go ahead and check out the comment to see all of this, well, in a nicer way for you on your screen, right? Because it's a pretty long line of code and I don't want to split it up. But as I said, we have that GitHub repository where everything is really covered and split up into every day's commit. So it's definitely not a problem for you to go ahead and check out the GitHub commit if you have any kind of errors or something like that. Awesome, so that's everything we have to do inside of the component. Now let's switch over to our HTML. Now let's scroll down into register here. And again, we go ahead and say if this.form.invalid, we want to return. So if the form is not valid, we will not be able to register a new passenger, right? Now let's switch over to our HTML. Instead of writing all that HTML from scratch now, I will go ahead and copy in the specific, well, validation messages. You can find this also in the GitHub repository. It will be highlighted here in that register component HTML. So what I want to do is here in email, inside of that form, right, below the label, I want to paste that in here. It's a div. We got a class again, invalid feedback dblock, and assigned to it is an ngIf, only if email is invalid and email is dirty or email is touched. Then we want to go ahead and check div ngIf form controls email has any errors. Then we want to show email is invalid, right? So if you like, you can for sure split that up in a different format. Absolutely no problem. So just like that, for example, it was just easier to explain. So you can keep it like this. Now, form control email errors. So for email, it's like, hey, your email address is invalid. We don't need to show any other information here. Now let's proceed with the next one with first name. So again, below the label, go ahead and copy in the validation message, which you can find in the GitHub. Invalid feedback dblock, styling is always the same. Again, we have that ngIf, form control first name, this time for sure, invalid and dirty or touched. We want to go ahead, check ngIf, we have any errors, first name is invalid. Right now, we only show one specific error to at least tell the user anything. Again, same stuff for the last one, which is last name, below the label, paste it in. You can see ng form last name invalid, dirty, touched, ngIf form controls last name errors, last name is invalid. So if we have any errors, last name is invalid will be shown to the user. So as I said, or as I said the whole time, once you understood the core concept, you are overall repeating the same stuff the whole time. You have one input field, one validation message, and if you have 10 input fields, you want to copy that over like 10 times for all of the input fields or all of the controls that you have. And that's one of the nice things about web development in general. Once you understood the complex topics of how everything is working, you can just use the same mechanics over and over again to really build a very huge application. Now we could potentially go ahead, for example, for the last name or for first name and say, or add another information about errors, something like, hey, you need to have at least 2 characters to check. If the last name is below 2 characters or up to 35 characters, and then show, hey, your name is too long or whatever, you already know how this is working, so we don't need to show it here again. If you don't remember, just take a look again at the number of seeds. We've implemented it there. We created a getter and then checked, hey, do we have any value? Is the value below 0, or sorry, below 1, or is the value over 254, right? So these are 3 different conditions with 3 different messages, but right now here for last name, first name and email address, we don't want to do that because we don't want to blow up our HTML input here right now in the course, because once you understood the concept, as I said, you can just copy it over. So if you want to implement that for last name, first name and email address, simply create the getters, get the information about how long the string is, and then depending on that, create ngIfs, a nested one, to check which error you want to show to the user, right? So if the first name is too short, show your first name is too short. If it's too long, show first name is too long. You got the point, right? So right now we will stay here with general basic error messages that should definitely make the point clear. Let's check that. Visit our application. Here we are. Now let me enter some information. JL, you can see email is invalid, add, there we go, dev.com. And now Janik, J, that's not long enough, A, there we go, and it will fire here. Nice. So yeah, same goes for last name for sure. So if I go ahead and write down here Al, you can see last name invalid, and if I enter a real value, it works. So that's fine. Now let's click on login, and you can see we can proceed and start booking a flight. So everything works. When I click here book flight, my booking works. So now we have validated all of the forms inside of our application, which is a huge step forward because we now can guide the user to grab the input that we really want to have from him.